Sorry, one second. Hi, welcome to the Balancing Work and Cancer webinar with Rachel Becker. My name is Savannah Shine. I'm the Ovarian Cancer Program Director at SHARE. Before the presentation begins, I'd like to tell you a little bit about SHARE. SHARE is a 40-year-old nonprofit organization that helps people through breast or ovarian cancer, offering the support of those who've been there. SHARE offers many services, including helplines, telephone, and in-person support groups, and educational programs. All services are free. For more information, please visit our website. It's www.sharecancersupport.org. A little bit about this webinar. All participants will be muted during the presentation. When Ms. Becker finishes speaking, I will open it up for questions and answers. Please submit your questions throughout the presentation at any point, and I will read them to her during the Q&A. What you can do to submit your questions is go to the question pane in the control panel on your screen, and you can submit the questions there at any point throughout the presentation. Also a note, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the SHARE website soon. I'd now like to introduce our speaker. Rachel Becker is the Assistant Director of Programs at Cancer and Careers, where she provides direct support and referrals to CAC's diverse audiences. She co-manages the Travel Scholarship Program for the National Conference on Work and Cancer and oversees all 13 of CAC's webinar programs. Additionally, Rachel regularly presents on topics related to cancer and work at community-based events and cancer conferences around the country. Prior to joining Cancer and Careers, Rachel completed a fellowship in psycho-oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and worked in a clinical capacity at New York Methodist Hospital and the Jewish Child Care Association. She holds a BA from Rutgers University and graduated summa cum laude with an MSW from NYU's Silver School of Social Work, where she was a recipient of the Zelda Foster Fellowship in Palliative and End-of-Life Care. I'm going to pass it over to Rachel Becker now. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you on the phone for attending today and on the computer as well, obviously. I'm really excited to be here talking to you about work and cancer. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Cancer and Careers, we are a 15-year-old national nonprofit and the only organization in the U.S. that is solely focused on issues at the intersection of work and cancer. Our mission is to educate and empower working people with cancer to thrive in their work environment, whatever that environment is. And we provide support through a number of programs and resources, all of which are provided free of charge. Our comprehensive website has a ton of information and articles available for download. We also have a number of publications available in both English and Spanish, which we will ship for free anywhere in the United States. We also offer career coaching as well as educational webinars, which take place throughout the year and are also archived on our website. And we offer in-person events. As Savannah mentioned, we do participate in community-based events, but we also host larger conferences ourselves. So we just this past weekend had our second annual West Coast Conference on Work and Cancer. That was in Los Angeles. In the spring, we offer our Midwest Conference on Work and Cancer, which takes place in Chicago. And then our National Conference on Work and Cancer is held every June in New York City. And for those of you who are outside of the New York City area, we do offer travel scholarships for that event. And applications for those scholarships are going to open on January 1st. So if you'd like to join us in New York, please do take a look at our website around January and send in an application. So we have about 60 minutes today, which is enough time to touch on the major issues and considerations that sit at this intersection of work and cancer, but there is always more to discuss. So clearly we have the question and answer period at the end of the hour, but I'll also provide my contact information on the last slide, so you can feel free to reach out if anything comes up for you after today's presentation. So as we begin, you'll notice that these slides are set up in a kind of narrative arc. And that arc is there to give us some structure to talk about work and cancer. And I imagine that many of you are in different places in terms of your own story and your own journey. And so maybe some of you have just received a diagnosis. Some of you may have already made decisions about working through treatment and are very much experts in your own right on this topic. And then some of you may have taken some time off and are looking at going back to work now. But regardless of where you are today, you'll hopefully find some things to pull out of this narrative arc that apply now. And then maybe some to take with you for later on. Because there's information at every point along the spectrum of what we're going to discuss today that can be applied differently in the naturally very less structured paths that our lives all take and that you individually follow in your lives. But we're going to start today by thinking about the various tensions and challenges that come up after receiving a diagnosis. And specifically, when we start to think about how work and life and everything is going to come together, it's important to recognize that a lot of questions start to crop up. And sometimes the answers to those questions are naturally in conflict with each other. And that's something that we at Cancer and Careers refer to as the diagnosis work dilemma. But in the midst of asking and answering these questions, specifically, am I going to work or am I not going to work during treatment, there are two overarching questions that kind of they can help to illuminate the best path forward for you inside all of the chaos and moving pieces that you're trying to figure out. And so the first question to ask is, how important is work to you personally? And then the second is, what information do you actually need to have physically in front of you in order to make good decisions about work? So inevitably, answering these two questions is going to lead to a whole host of additional questions, such as, how is work going to affect your treatment schedule, and vice versa? And certainly talking with your healthcare team about that is going to be very important. I'm sure we have some experts on the line and having conversations with our healthcare team as well. But specifically, we want you to think about specific things related to keeping you on the job or figuring out how and where time off needs to be taken. So thinking about when your side effects are likely to kick in. Some chemotherapy regimens have a sort of bad day that begins immediately after the infusion takes place. So if your team is telling you that you're on that sort of protocol, you might want to schedule your treatment for a Friday. And that way the bad side effects will kick in right away, and then you'll have the weekend right there to rest and recuperate. Conversely, you might have a more delayed reaction with the particular chemotherapy you're on, in which case you might think about having your treatment happen on a Wednesday so that a couple of days can pass and then you have the weekend there to rest. So it's really about being strategic in your thinking when you're planning for appointments, but also being proactive. We hear from a lot of patients who, their doctor will say to them, how about you come in on Tuesday for your next infusion? And maybe the doctor is saying that because there is a medical reason to have the treatment next Tuesday, but it also might be the case that that's just when the next available appointment is. So thinking about your personal needs and your personal schedule, and then speaking up and saying, hey, Thursday is going to be a little bit better for me. Do you have that open? Can be really helpful in sort of letting you take back control of things that are happening at this moment where so much feels out of control. It's also really important to talk to your healthcare team about the other parts of your work week, such as your commute. So we don't magically appear at work. We have to take steps to get ourselves there. So if you're somebody who needs to sit 90 minutes in traffic, in rush hour traffic each way to get to work, your 9 to 5 workday is actually a 7:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. workday. So that's 11 hours. And it's important to find out whether, if treatment progresses and side effects start to accumulate, if that's going to continue to be realistic. Similarly, if you're like me and you live in New York City or somewhere else and you're reliant on public transportation, are you going to be able to continue to do that? If you have a compromised immune system, the New York City subway system during cold season is not a place you're probably going to want to be, or your healthcare team is going to want you to be. So bringing that into the dialogue with them is really important. And then, of course, no person is only their diagnosis and their job. So what other things will you want to save some of your energy for? Things like helping kids with homework or taking care of an aging parent? Or maybe you're taking a cooking class that you're particularly passionate about. Because all of us, no matter who we are, have a limited pool of internal resources and energy that we divvy up into our own personal pie chart. And when you throw cancer into the mix, that pie gets increasingly smaller and smaller as treatment continues. So prioritizing becomes increasingly important. And clearly, finances and insurance are usually tied to our jobs and very important. So often, those are the driving factors for people in making decisions about whether or not they're going to work through treatment. But it's important to remember that they're not the only driving factors for everyone. Many people want to continue working because it's part of who they are. It's part of their identity. And particularly in this country, we're so work-driven. If we meet somebody for the first time, we typically say to them, "What do you do?" We don't say, "What's the last great book you read?" or "What's your favorite meal you ever had?" It's a really profound question to ask, "What do you do?" And so finding out that a cancer treatment is going to change your ability to work or maybe create a reality where you're not able to work for a while can often be really emotionally distressing. So talking to your healthcare team, finding out what the circumstances are going to be in terms of taking time off, and also communicating to them why it is that you want to work and helping them to understand why it's personally important to you if it is. Now, I mentioned you're going to want to gather some information to help you make decisions, and this slide illustrates the 3 buckets into which that information can be sorted. So the first bucket is medical and treatment information, and clearly we just spent a bunch of time talking about that. The next bucket is work information. So there you're going to want to look into the benefits that you have through your employer, such as paid time off and health insurance and the like, but also existing workplace policies such as donated leave pools, or whether there's a process for requesting reasonable accommodations, and that phrase I just used, reasonable accommodations, is a legal term. I'm going to define it a little bit later on, so don't worry, we are going to get to it. But getting back to thinking about these benefits and policies, the place that you're going to want to take a look to get more information is typically an employee manual. Sometimes they're the stack of paper that we get handed when we sign our employment contracts, and then we stash it somewhere in our desk drawer, maybe under the snacks that we have in the afternoon. Often they're found online these days. But the idea is that it's time to dig through that document and figure out what's already in place and available to you. And then the third category is legal information. And so I am a social worker by training. I'm not an attorney, but I do want to spend some time talking about the laws. It's actually very important to spend some time thinking about the legal piece of the equation, not necessarily because we think that a situation is likely to become litigious, but because the law exists as a tool. And I think that a lot of us live in this country in fear of laws. We think of them as rules that we don't want to break, because if we break them, we're going to get in trouble or suffer consequences of some sort. But the fact is that laws also provide structure and protections. And those protections really are tools that can be employed, and often are employed by people, to really successfully create the path to working through cancer treatment. So one of my large goals here is to help demystify some of those laws so that you can start to understand how to apply them if that's something that's going to be right for you. So when it comes to legal rights, there are 3 areas that you're going to look. And again, I'm going to talk about these in very broad terms because I'm not an attorney. But on the federal level, there is a law called the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I'm going to cover in much more detail on the next slide. And then on the state level, there are fair employment laws that vary from state to state. And in many cases, they expand the protections that are available through the ADA. So it's really important to take a look at your state laws along with this federal law. And then the third place you're going to want to look is your specific employment contract. So that may include union contracts, as well as the agreement that you have with your employer that specifies the terms of your employment. And essentially, it's really going to be any document that you signed when you got your job, because there's often descriptions of terms, additional protections, things along those lines. So as I mentioned, the ADA is a federal law, but that does not mean that everyone has access to it. There are 3 hurdles to clear. And if you do clear those hurdles to the ADA, it provides protections from discrimination in the workplace, and it may also provide access to reasonable accommodations, which again is that term we're going to define shortly. So in order to qualify, first, you must work for a private employer with 15 or more employees. Now, it's possible that the fair employment laws in your state can offer greater protection, as I mentioned, so do take a look at those, because one of the ways that they may provide greater protection is by reducing this number. So, for example, I'm in New York, where the state fair employment laws say that you're protected if you work for an employer with 4 or more employees. So really essential to take a look at those. The third hurdle is that you must be a qualified individual, which very simply means that you're qualified to do the job that you've been hired to do. So a long-haul truck driver would need to have a commercial trucking license, a surgeon would have had to go to medical school, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third hurdle is that you have to be considered to have a disability under the ADA's specific definition of the word disability. So I encourage you not to get hung up on the word disability. Each law has its own definition of the word that was created by Congress in order to give shape to the legislation as it was being created. And so I travel a lot around the country, and I meet a lot of survivors who say, well, I don't have a disability, I have a disease. And in this circumstance, it's not about that kind of technicality and how it applies. It's about whether you line up with a specific definition that's in this law in order to access protection. So while we're talking about rights, I want to touch on what your rights are when it comes to disclosure. And we get asked a lot if it is a requirement to disclose to an employer that a cancer diagnosis has been made. And the answer is no. You are not required by law to share information about your health with an employer at any point. That said, it may be necessary to share some information if you want to access certain legal protections. But you only need to share enough information to access that particular benefit. So we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. But while we're on this topic of sharing the news and disclosure in general, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the online space. And so clearly the internet is becoming more and more ubiquitous these days. It's how we're all sitting here together today. And also social media is becoming an increasingly important part of many people's cancer journeys. It provides an instant support network in the lonely moments. It's a way to really connect with people who are going through the same thing. But another phenomenon that we're hearing a lot about is that it's becoming increasingly common for employers to Google. And this includes both hiring managers who are looking at prospective candidates, as well as current employers who are looking to learn more about the people who are working for them. And typically these searches aren't done maliciously. They're usually done because a hiring manager wants to make an argument for hiring a particular person, so is trying to find out more. Similarly, as I mentioned, current employers just want to get to know the people who are working for them. But it's still possible that they're going to come across information that you'd rather they not know. So I want to be very clear that I'm not saying never post. But what I am saying is that it's important to have a better understanding of the virtual landscape so that you can feel empowered to make informed decisions about how your story is being presented online. Now, I'm guessing that there are probably a couple of you on the line who at this moment are thinking about privacy settings and saying, well, you know, I've really locked down my Facebook account and so I'm pretty sure I'm okay. But the fact is that things are a little bit more complicated than that. So this image is a little bit outdated at this point, but it was published in the Wall Street Journal in March of 2013. And what it illustrates is all the steps that a person would have had to have taken at that moment in time in March 2013 in order to ensure that their Facebook profile was 100% protected. So when I look at that, I can't help but think that is a whole lot of work. And what's even more important to know is that even if you do take the time, is that this particular image, it was probably outdated by April of 2013, so the following month. And that's because Facebook and sites like it change their privacy policies on a very regular basis. Because the bottom line is that Facebook and sites like it are designed to sell us things. They make their money from advertisers. Now, on the one hand, that's good because it's part of the reason we never have to pay for Facebook or Instagram. But on the other hand, it means that they're constantly making new deals with these advertisers to sell them data, to sell them information about the things that we're interested in and the way that we behave online. So what that means is that while we have this sense often that Facebook is a place, and other sites like it as well, are places where we are inviting people into our community, they're inviting us in, and therefore there's this sort of level of protection, it's an imperfect system. And that can lead to a little bit more, that can lead to an unintentional disclosure of information as policies change. So it's essential to know that there are sites like My Lifeline and Caring Bridge, which are designed with a higher level of security and privacy. However, you should know that even on these sites, profiles that you create are not protected 100%. So if you do have a profile on one of these sites or are looking to build one, I recommend checking out the Cancer and Careers website. We have a Maintaining Online Privacy document which can be downloaded for free that'll walk you through the steps to making sure your profile is protected. So if privacy policies provide imperfect protection, what other steps can be taken? Well, the first is to make really clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer journey you're going to share online. And then once you've made those decisions, communicate them very clearly with the people in your network and the people that you're close to. I can't tell you how many times we've heard stories about survivors who were accidentally outed by very well-intentioned loved ones who tagged them in a post that they shared online without knowing that the person who was going through the treatment was trying to keep that information private. And so really talking to the people who might be communicating this information online themselves is essential to making sure that you stay in control of the way your narrative is being shared. And now, there may be some of you on the line right now who have already disclosed at work and are having a great experience with it, that your supervisor is being really understanding and everyone is being really supportive, and that's wonderful. We love hearing stories like that. However, I would encourage you to also think about the fact that there can be a long-term impact associated with sharing things online. So the internet, at the end of the day, the internet doesn't go away, and it's a public space, and once something is out there, it's out there. So it is possible to delete posts that you've put up already, but the reality is that they always exist somewhere in cyberspace. And the other reality or another reality, I should say. There are lots of realities in life. But another one is that none of us really knows what's going to happen to us down the line. And so even if things are really great at work right now, you never know if 5 years from now you're going to be looking for another job, or if your really awesome supervisor who's being super supportive is going to move on and be replaced with somebody who has a different attitude, because that's something that we hear about happening as well. So you never know how people are going to respond to that information. Hopefully they respond well, but because we never know, it's good to make decisions up front rather than having regrets about things that we've shared. Now, there are also plenty of opportunities to take control about what comes up about you in searches, and that involves being strategic about what you post online. So the sites that you see listed on this particular slide, LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram, etc., those all rank really high in Google searches. So the idea would be to start sharing articles that pertain to your particular area of employment or interest, or to start talking about some thoughts that you have about trends that are going on in the professional field, so that that will push any posts that you don't want to be found further down your timeline, and bring to the forefront the information that you're really proud to have shown to an employer and proud to talk about in an interview. It's also a good idea to think deliberately about what you post. So that's obviously part of the strategy here. And we recommend running any potential post through some filter questions. So thinking about whether you would want a boss, either current or future, or your coworkers to know what you're sharing. Or perhaps thinking whether you'd want this on the front page of a newspaper. How would you feel if that were to happen? Or would you want a family member to see it, a grandmother or a mother? So if the answer to any of those questions leaves you not so sure, feeling not so great about how you'd feel, maybe it's time to rework that post before putting it out into the internet. It's also a great idea to set up a professional web page or blog. That is likely to show up high in a Google search, and if you do have a professional web page or blog, that is going to attract the eye of hiring managers. So taking a look at those, and it's actually a lot easier to do these days than it ever has been before. There are a lot of sites that walk you through how to build a professional page step by step, even if you don't have any experience with doing so up to this point. All right, now let's jump back into the workplace and talk about sharing a diagnosis at work. So when thinking about whether or not you want to share the information about your cancer status at work, there are two major things to consider overall. The first, how is treatment going to interfere with your ability to perform your job duties? And then the second, what legal benefits are there to sharing this information at work? However, it's also important to note that you may wish to disclose for a variety of other reasons as well. So for example, some people are sharers, and they can't imagine going to work every day and sitting next to the people they work with and not having them know what's going on, that there's this really big event going on in their lives. It's also the case that there are some people who are not sharers, or they have very specific feelings about sharing medical information at work, and it's not something that they want to do. So it's really about knowing who you are in terms of your communication style, and trusting that however you feel is valid and should be taken into account when you're planning any disclosure conversations. The individual culture of the workplace may also play a role in how you think about disclosure. So is it a small company where your colleagues feel like a second family and everyone comes in on Monday and stands around the water cooler chatting about their weekends? Or is it a big corporation where the environment is more competitive and people are always heads down and working on getting things done? Or maybe it's a combination of the two somehow. There could be a spectrum of possibilities for what your individual workplace culture is. But the point is to be thinking about the various ways that people communicate with each other at work, as that can help you to decide how or if you want to share information at work. You might also think about whether anyone in your workplace has gone through something similar. So maybe you don't know of anyone who has a cancer diagnosis, but perhaps there's somebody who went out on maternity leave, or a guy a couple cubicles down who you know has an aging parent, and you've seen that he's gotten some accommodations in order to manage caring for her. So thinking about how the message was received at work and how colleagues responded, how supervisors responded, can all be important information to take into account as you're planning your disclosure conversation. And then finally, you do want to be thinking about past performance reviews as well. So if you are a person who's been at an organization for a couple of years and you've always gotten gold star performance reviews, but your medical team has told you that you're likely to experience fatigue or some other side effect that is potentially going to decrease your performance, it's a good idea to say something at work in order to put some context around why your performance may be changing. Because if it comes to performance review time and they pull out all those gold star reviews, and then they also look at what you've done this year and see that there's been a decline or a change, not for the better, you want them to have some context about why that happened, rather than leaving your employer to fill in the blanks about what's going on, because that can have some long-lasting negative consequences as well. We also get asked a lot, who should I tell? And we like to remind people that it's entirely possible that you're going to have more than one disclosure conversation. And so if that's the case, we recommend going to the person that it's easiest for you to communicate with first. For many people, that's a direct supervisor because they already have an established and ongoing dialogue with this person, maybe even a close relationship sometimes. But it's important to remember, if you're going to talk to your supervisor, that not all managers are trained to be managers. So it's entirely possible that when you sit down to have this conversation, the person on the other side of the table is going to be having this conversation for the first time as well. And so we have created a document at Cancer and Careers called our Manager's Toolkit, which you can download for free. And that's a document that you can bring into any conversation that you have with your manager that provides information to them about how they can best support you while you're going through treatment. For other people, going to HR is something that they want to do, and HR can be a wonderful resource. They often have supported other people through similar issues. They are usually very acquainted with the policies and procedures that are in your employee handbook, so they can help clarify some of those. But it's also the case that HR at any company plays a dual role. So they are there to look out for the best interests of the employees, but they're also out to look out for the best interests of the employer. So it's important to remember that what you share in any conversation with HR may be communicated up the chain of command. So it may not be entirely confidential. And that's something to factor into your thinking when your disclosure. And then perhaps the most important item to include in any disclosure conversation is the idea that treatment is going to be fluid. That the things that you are sharing today are what you know today, but that they may not apply next week or next month or 6 months from now. So this is likely to be an ongoing conversation. You're also going to want to spend some time thinking through the reality of your physical self in the workplace and how you personally are going to manage your unique side effects. Now, obviously, this in part has to do with wanting to be comfortable, because we do want you to be comfortable while you're doing your job, but it's also important to think about any potential physical, visible side effects that might occur. And especially if you are not going to be disclosing at work, or if you are sharing only a limited amount of information at work, because changes in appearance can, and we do hear stories about them prompting questions from coworkers, even if they're well-intended. And those questions can often leave people feeling like they don't know how to respond, and so sometimes folks accidentally disclose more information than they might have ideally liked to have shared. So we're going to talk a little bit more later on about crafting responses to questions that might come up, but it's an important thing to take into consideration when you're thinking about disclosure. Now, by far and away, the number one side effect that people ask us about when it comes to working through treatment is chemo brain. And unfortunately, there are no magic bullet solutions when it comes to working with chemo brain or brain fog. It's really about going back to basics. And the first thing to keep in mind is just letting go of the idea of multitasking altogether. Because as this slide shows us, most of us aren't really good at it anyway, regardless of our health or our age or any other factors. And from there, you really want to start getting organized. So find one notebook that you can take with you everywhere so that there aren't individual notebooks that you have at home and in the car and in the office, because that prevents you from showing up to a board meeting with your grocery list instead of the notes that you made in preparation. That one notebook is much easier to keep track of, and then you know that you have everything all in the same place with you. We also recommend writing down everything, including a prioritized list of to-dos at work, and then taking on those to-dos one item at a time. Also, turning off the phone in your workspace, turning off email notifications so that they don't cause distractions can be really beneficial. If you work in an environment where there's a shared calendar system, perhaps even scheduling appointments with yourself on the calendar to focus on a particular project, and then telling your supervisor and your team members that you're going to be working during that time can really help manage their expectations and take some of the pressure off of you so that you don't feel obligated to jump immediately if somebody emails you and wants to know the answer to a question. Additionally, it's good to think about preparing for any conversations that you may have and rehearsing those conversations, particularly if you have a very phone-driven job, making sure that you can make sure that you hit all the points that you want to hit while you're on the phone. And also keeping in mind that stress can really hinder ability to focus as well. So taking a couple deep breaths or taking a walk around the office or the block can really go a long way in terms of helping you to reset the stress button and re-engage and focus. Another strategy is to identify a point person. And clearly, this point person isn't going to work in all environments. But in settings where it does, it can be a really excellent solution. So the point person should be someone that you trust, who can be a centralized point of information about everything that is going on with you in terms of your treatment. We hear a lot of stories from people who are being approached by their colleagues who want to know how treatment is going and how they're feeling and all of that. But those questions can be distracting. And so having that point person available to answer questions can help you focus. On the other side of the equation, when you're out of the office for a doctor's appointment, etc., that point person can be your go-to for getting information about what's happening at work. And then the second bullet point is something that I think a lot of people struggle with, regardless of where they are in their lives and in their careers, and that involves knowing what limits are, what your personal limits are, and setting boundaries and sticking with them. Because during cancer treatment, that's a really essential time to be taking care of yourself and knowing what your limitations are into survivorship as well. So what we've included on this slide are a couple examples of something that we call the professional no, which are sound bites for responding if somebody asks you to take on extra pieces of work. So you're going to have to continue doing the essential functions of your job most likely, but it's okay to say no to those little extra projects that come up. And again, here are a couple of examples for you to be thinking about. So now, as promised, reasonable accommodations. And this is a term, as I mentioned, which comes to us from the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the reasonable accommodations are defined as any change in the work environment or in the way things are customarily done that enable an individual with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities. So that's kind of a mouthful. And what we've found is, rather than continuing to explain those definitions or break it down in any way, giving some examples can go a long way. So our favorite example, I should say, the first accommodation that we're going to talk about involves modifying workspace. So that means changing the physical space in which you're doing your job. And our favorite example of this is the story of a social worker that we worked with a few years back. And she was one of these people whose job, it was very important for her to continue working during treatment. She was very closely identified with her job, and it was helping her to cope. But she was experiencing a lot of nausea during the day while she was at work. And what was unusual was that she was not experiencing that nausea when she was at home on the weekends. And she was also not, or rather, she was not experiencing that nausea when she was home in the evenings. And she was also not experiencing it during the same daytime hours when she was at home on the weekend. So it was a little bit of a mystery. But we sat with her and we talked and we asked a lot of questions. And what we ultimately discovered was that her office was located right next to the cafeteria. And so the smells of the cooking food were wafting into her doorway, and they were making her feel nauseous. So for her, the reasonable accommodation was to switch offices with someone who was further away from the cafeteria. And this switch didn't make working through treatment a breeze, but it did make it so that she wasn't experiencing that one side effect, and it made it easier for her to stay on the job. Another example might be getting a printer to keep near someone's desk so that they don't have to walk across the office every single time they print a document, because if someone's experiencing fatigue, that can be very draining. So there's no one-size-fits-all accommodation. It's really about peeling back the layers of the onion to figure out what's going on and then being creative with possible solutions. Another possible accommodation might be to modify schedule. So for those who have jobs where they can telecommute, that can be a really wonderful accommodation. Now, clearly, that's not going to work for everybody. A forklift driver is not able to telecommute their position, or at least not yet. But it is becoming more and more commonplace for offices and other such working environments to have telecommuting options available for people even when they're not going through a medical experience. So finding out if that's available is a good idea. It's something you can maybe find in your employee handbook. Also thinking about whether you can work a full-time but flexible schedule. So this might mean you ultimately work the same number of hours, but they're just distributed differently. So if you know that you feel better in the morning, but by afternoon your energy's dipping and you're not feeling so hot anymore, you might see about shifting a 9 to 5 schedule to be 7 to 3 instead. Alternatively, you might take a look at doing a 40-hour work week over the course of 4 10-hour work days instead of 5 8-hour work days, so then you have a day off for treatment. Additionally, if your job includes allocated break times, it might be possible to work in some additional breaks. So maybe instead of a 45-minute lunch break and 2 15-minute breaks throughout the day, you have a whole bunch of 15-minute breaks throughout the day that will allow you to sit down and rest and do what it is that you need to do. So again, really being creative and thinking about uses of time. And then the third category are these other options. So thinking about whether you could access technology like speak-type software, that could be a potential accommodation. Change in a particular company policy could be considered an accommodation. So for example, a grocery store clerk might be allowed to have a stool at her workstation if she's experiencing fatigue and can't stand. Another possibility would be to shift the non-essential portion of someone's job. So if we think about a second grade teacher, They might have recess duty that requires that they stay outside and run around and chase after kids running around on the playground. So maybe instead of doing that, they could have an additional prep period where they could sit and rest, or maybe they could be shifted to do hall pass duty instead. And then lastly, and probably the least common accommodation, someone could move to another open position if one exists. So the important thing to note is that their job is not required to create an open position for you if one does not exist already. But if there is an open position and you are qualified to do it, that can be a really useful solution to continuing to work while treatment is going on. But the bottom line in thinking about these accommodations is that most of them cost employers $500 or less. That's a number that comes directly out of some research that's been done on this topic. And many of them cost nothing at all. So all of these examples here to get you started thinking about accommodations that might work for you. Now, when it comes to returning to work, people tend to fall into one of two categories. They're either going back to a job that they've held already and they're familiar with, or they're going to be going to a new job. So both present their unique challenges and their pros as well. So when you're thinking about returning to a job that you held before, probably the biggest pro is that it's familiar territory. So you know the culture and quirks of the work environment. You know your colleagues and your boss and the responsibilities that go into doing the job. But there's a major con as well, which is the very sneaky before picture, which a lot of people can feel that they're really in competition with. We need to ease back into the routine when we've taken time away from work for something like cancer. And so while you may have this impulse to hit the ground running and show everyone that you still can do the same level of work, it's good to take some time to think about what the realities of that return is going to be and what the realities of your energy levels are right now, because it does often take time to build back up to the place that you were before. We also hear frequently from people who are concerned about being branded as the quote-unquote cancer person at their job, and they're very eager to return to work and move past the experiences that they've just had. And so what we recommend in situations like this is using a verbal technique that we call the swivel. So like the professional no, it's a verbal formula or pattern that can be used in response to cancer-related comments that might be made. So it involves acknowledging the cancer-related comment, putting an and right in the middle, and then swiveling the conversation around to a topic that's more work-oriented. So for example, if someone were to come up to you and say, you know, my uncle had cancer, you might say, thank you for sharing that. That must have been very challenging. And while you're here, do you have a few minutes to discuss the project that's due next week? I have some questions. The idea is that people will pick up the conversation from any point that you leave it off at. So turning it to an area where you feel comfortable talking allows you to stay in control and allows you to position yourself as a full, robust, and professional person, not just quote-unquote the cancer person. And there's another example of a swivel for you. Now, when it comes to looking for a new job, there are many challenges and unknowns, so it's important to feel in control in the process. And the first thing to remember is that job searching is a fluid process, that it can take time, and that you should be thinking about what you want and not just what you need out of a job. And one way that you can feel more in control of your job search experience is by remembering that there are ordered steps in the process, just like there are with dating. So if you think about it, the way that you communicate with someone on a first date is different from the way that you communicate with them 2 months in or 6 months into a relationship, and it's certainly different from the way that you're communicating with them by the time you're getting engaged or getting married. So being aware of that order is important. We're going to walk through that right now. So the first step is networking. And we know from one of our professional career coaches that it's how about 85% of jobs are found. So a lot of people struggle with the idea of networking because it feels like asking for a favor. But it's important to know that it really is the most effective way to find your way into a new position, and to not think too narrowly about what your network is. It could really be anybody, somebody in your religious community, or somebody who you see at the coffee shop every day and have a casual relationship with. You never know where a next job is going to come from. Also, LinkedIn, which is the network for professional networking, social network for professional networking, is a wonderful tool. And if you are interested in learning more about LinkedIn, I recommend going to our website. We held a webinar earlier this year called Building an Effective LinkedIn Profile that was led by one of our career coaches, and it's got some really great tips for creating or maximizing your profile. Now, LinkedIn does not eliminate the time-tested tools of job searching, which very specifically are effective resumes and cover letters. And I've included a couple of tips for those here. Very important to remember that you want to tailor both cover letters and resumes to specifically address the needs of the position that's being advertised for. And I also want to mention that we frequently get asked whether people should disclose a cancer experience in a cover letter. And our response to this is that, it is ultimately up to you to decide how you want to run your job search. But there's been some research done in the past year or so, very new research actually, that's shown that people who disclose a cancer diagnosis or some sort of other disability in a cover letter are less likely to get called in for a job interview. And so if you think back to that metaphor of job searching being like dating, the message that you've got something going on in your medical history is going to be received in a particular way when it's written down on paper, and that can be received very differently when it's a message that's delivered in person after whoever's on the other side of the table has had the opportunity to get to know who you are. So we do recommend that if you are interested in disclosing as part of a job search, that you wait until you've had at least one interview so that they can get a sense of who you are and what you bring to the table. And it's also important to remember that not everyone discloses everything in a job interview. Omission is actually an interview technique that's employed by a lot of people because their primary job in an interview process is to position themselves as the most savvy candidate for the job. So talking about past experiences and skill sets and why you're excited about that particular position is a much better way to use the limited time that you have in an interview or the limited space that you have in a cover letter. We also hear a lot from people who are concerned about a gap on their resume and being asked about that in an interview process. And what I will tell you is that post-2008, there's been some research done that shows that hiring managers are much more used to seeing gaps on resumes for all sorts of reasons. So you may not get asked about a gap on a resume, but it is another opportunity to swivel. And so here are a couple of examples of how you might use a swivel in an interview to address a gap on a resume. And wherever you're swiveling, the important thing to remember is that you should use language that you feel comfortable saying, that feels good coming out of your mouth. And so talking to any social workers who are on your team can be really useful. They're often excellent resources for coming up with your own swivel. Now, we talked about employers Googling, but the great thing about the internet is that you can also research an employer as well. And beyond helping you to understand the company and prepare for an interview, this can also give you some information about that employer. So finding out things like whether they have a history of discrimination lawsuits, or how many people work there. If you think you might need to use the ADA, you're definitely going to want to find out if there are 15 or more people in that workplace. So lots of sites like Glassdoor and LinkedIn can be really useful for finding more information about the company and helping you to decide if that's someone that you want to work for, regardless of whether they give you an offer. And then, of course, the ultimate goal of any job search is to start working with a new employer. And so as you get started, it's important to spend some time and energy thinking about how you're going to assimilate, how the culture of the place functions, and what the quirks are, because every workplace has its little quirks and dysfunctions. So how can you be successful in the reality of whatever those are? And then, of course, the very big pro about working with a new employer is that it's a chance to start fresh, and that nobody knows your cancer history. So if you don't want that to be known at work, you don't have to share it. And then finally, I'll leave you with this. No one hires a new employee with the intention of watching them fail. Employers hire people because they believe in their ability to succeed, and they want to support them in their ability to succeed. So remembering that it's okay to take your time, that you can be smart about how you approach the job and look to the people around you as resources to help you be successful can be really empowering when returning to work and starting a new job. So that's the end of our content. I do want to quickly tell you about a couple of programs before we go to question and answers. We have the micro-grant program. Applications are live for that right now. So we provide small grants to people who are interested in doing professional development. So nothing tuition-based like grad school or undergrad, but if you want to take a course or get a certification, I encourage you to apply. Here are also some additional resources for legal information, as well as my contact information as promised. So I guess I'll turn it over for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It was a great presentation. And thanks to all of you for participating. We do have a couple questions. I want to encourage anybody with questions to please use the question panel in your control panel, the question pane, and you can submit them there. So Rachel, one of the questions was, and you did touch on this about managing a career change during cancer. That what are the most important things in looking at for the new role or the new job that you might want?
Sure.
Prioritizing.
Absolutely. So I'm actually going to defer this question to one of our career coaches, because Cancer and Careers had a webinar earlier this year on career change fully. So walking all the way through the important things to think about. So for the time being, what I will say is that you do want to take a look at what your skills and what your accomplishments are and how those are going to translate into whatever new field you're going to be working in, and thinking about whether any more training is necessary. So I'll leave those as two very important things to be thinking about, and also really encourage the asker of this question and anyone else to take a look at that archived webinar. Again, it's on our website, and it's an amazing, amazing resource for information on career change.
Perfect, thank you. One more question. For finding a job when you're in the search for a job, what's the best way to inquire about flexible scheduling or telecommuting? At what point during the interview process is it appropriate, or is it ever appropriate to bring that up?
Sure, no, absolutely. Yeah, that's an excellent, excellent question. So when it comes to thinking about potential benefits that are available through a job, because telecommuting is going to be a benefit, so in terms of asking the actual person that you're interviewing with, it is more appropriate to wait until later down the line. Third interview maybe, but certainly once you have an offer on the table, it's appropriate to ask about those things before you accept any offer. But what I will also say is that we had that slide, and I'll go back to it, on researching an employer. And that's one of the things that you might be able to find through research. So a Google search about whether there are telecommuting benefits. There are some websites. They're mostly, at this point, mommy focused in terms of making transparent the flexibilities that are available through certain organizations. So taking a look at some of those can be useful. But also if you networked your way into the job, finding out from the people who work there, or maybe on LinkedIn if there's someone that you can connect to and say, hey, just kind of curious about this, if you feel comfortable doing that. And then the other thing that I will do is put in a plug for a job messaging board, and we don't typically recommend that people use job message boards to apply for jobs because they are not particularly effective means for finding work. But the one exception to this rule is an organization called Flex Jobs, and they post exclusively work that has flexible hours or telecommuting options. And they do a very good job of vetting the positions that they're advertising for. So there aren't any internet scheming kind of jobs, and we do know from experience with people that we've worked with at Cancer and Careers that we've had folks get called in for interviews from the jobs they've applied for. So I would recommend taking a look at those if flexibility is something that you're interested in. It is a paid membership to apply for jobs through that site. You can look for free, but you have to purchase a year membership in order to apply. But there's a discount code that we have worked out with them. It is CANCER in all caps, and that will get you 50% off membership, which I think brings it down to $25 for a year subscription. And then we also have a certain amount of money earmarked at Cancer and Careers for people who are struggling with even a $25 payment. So shoot me an email if you're interested in a free Flex Jobs membership, and we can help make that happen.
Great. Thank you so much. That's actually all the questions. I'll give everybody one more minute in case anybody has any additional questions or if you had anything to add, Rachel. But I really want to thank you for your time.
Sure, thank you. And I'm also happy to make available copies of the slides if people would like those.
Great.
So
we will post them on our website. We will post this recorded presentation on our website soon.
Great.
So everybody can look back at that. Okay, I don't have any more questions, so I just wanted to let everybody know if you could please fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. You're going to need to file, exit, and leave the webinar in order to have the evaluation pop up. Sometimes it just takes a minute, but it really does help us make sure to get more of these great programs and specific to what you are interested in. So thank you so much again for your time, and thank you again.
All right, thank you.